A little girl vanishes from a luxury resort without leaving a trace. Millions of dollars are invested in the investigation. Suspects are interrogated, yet nothing. What really happened to Madeleine McCann? Was an important clue overlooked? Imagine a couple going out for dinner at a paradisiacal resort. The sky is clear, a gentle breeze flows through the hotel corridors, and the distant sound of conversations and laughter from other guests fills the air. Everything seemed normal, but when they returned to their room, the scene they found would change their lives forever. Madeleine McCann's bed was empty. The window was ajar. No sound, no sign of a struggle, no trace whatsoever. She simply vanished. It marked the beginning of one of the most enigmatic cases in history. The world stopped to follow every new piece of information. Headlines appeared every day. Experts debated theories on television. Both British and Portuguese authorities became involved, each holding a different view of what might have happened that night. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the disappearance itself, but the fact that, to this day, no one has been able to answer with certainty. What really happened to Madeleine? With every new clue, more questions arose. Some people believe she was abducted by a criminal network. Others suspect that there was an accident in the room and that someone covered it up. And to make everything even more confusing, there are details in the investigation that simply do not add up. But what if the answer has already been right in front of our eyes? What if the mistake wasn't the lack of clues, but the way all of them were interpreted? Now let's analyze the most shocking facts of this case and understand why, after all these years, the truth still seems out of reach. When we think of a disappearance, we imagine a scene of chaos, desperate parents, cries for help, immediate searches. But the Madeleine McCann case deviated from that pattern from the very beginning. The first strange thing was the family's reaction. Instead of calling the police immediately, the parents went back to the restaurant to inform their friends first. Only later, amid the confusion, did they make the official call. Another intriguing point was the lack of urgency in the initial investigation. The Portuguese police were slow to treat the scene as a crime scene. In the early days, guests came and went from the room, erasing potential clues before anyone took steps to preserve evidence. But what really defies common sense is the way suspicions were directed. Initially, the most obvious hypothesis was kidnapping. However, as the investigation advanced, indications began to emerge pointing to another scenario, one that no one wanted to consider. The authorities started to question, what if the disappearance wasn't the result of a crime committed by a stranger, but rather something that happened inside the apartment itself? The police found biological traces in the room and in a car rented by the McCanns weeks after the disappearance. What does that mean? The explanation was never entirely convincing. If these clues were ignored or misinterpreted, then the truth might be very different from what we imagine. The Madeleine case is not just a mystery, it is an example of how investigations can be sabotaged by mistakes, media influence, and even political pressure. From the start, the way everything was handled generated more questions than answers. The searches began too late. The security camera footage never provided anything conclusive. And over time, public opinion became divided between those who believed that Madeleine was kidnapped and those who saw contradictions in the parents' version. To make matters worse, the media turned the case into a full-blown spectacle. Sensational headlines emerged daily, spreading rumors and theories that further confused the investigation. Every new piece of information was released even before it was analyzed by the authorities, creating absurd pressure for the case to be solved quickly, which led to hasty assumptions. And of course, there was the political factor. The involvement of both British and Portuguese authorities generated friction, hindering the progress of the investigation. Instead of an efficient joint effort, there were two forces working with different visions, distrusting one another and competing for control of the case. The result? What could have been an efficient investigation turned into one of the most poorly conducted cases in modern history. Now, with advances in technology and new clues emerging, are we finally close to uncovering the truth? One of the most impactful scenes in this case occurred days after the disappearance. Kate McCann, Madeleine's mother, was seen holding her daughter's teddy bear. She carried it everywhere, as if that object were her last connection to the girl. The teddy bear appeared to have been recently washed. This raised an unsettling question. Why? If Madeleine had been taken by a kidnapper, what would be the need to clean something that belonged to her? It was a small detail, but it led investigators to start considering another possibility, one that would change the entire course of the investigation. If this investigation had been conducted differently, would we know by now what really happened to Madeleine McCann? Many clues were left behind. Others were never thoroughly investigated. Now let's analyze the most shocking evidence in this case and discover what might have been overlooked. In any criminal investigation, the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. This is known as Occam's razor. When there are multiple hypotheses, the most straightforward is often the true one. But in the case of Madeleine McCann, nothing is simple. If Madeleine was kidnapped, how is it that no one saw or heard anything? The resort was full that night. People were walking the streets, guests were dining in restaurants, and the parents themselves were just a few meters from the room. And yet no witness reported hearing screams, seeing someone leave with a child, or noticing any suspicious activity. Does that make sense? The police began the investigation, assuming it was a kidnapping. However, according to criminal profiling experts like John Douglas from the FBI, when a child goes missing, the first suspect is usually someone close to her. This doesn't necessarily mean the family has something to hide, but statistically, that's where most cases find answers. However, the Portuguese police were slow to follow that line of reasoning, and perhaps that was the first major mistake. There is an essential concept in criminal investigations known as the golden hour. This term refers to the first hours after a disappearance. When clues are still fresh, witnesses remember important details, and the chance of finding the victim alive is much higher. But in the Madeleine McCann case, that window of time was wasted. The Portuguese police took over 2 hours to arrive at the scene, and during that interval, something crucial happened. Apartment 5A was completely compromised. Guests, friends of the McCanns, resort staff, all came and went from the room before investigators arrived. Footprints were erased, objects were moved, and possible evidence was destroyed without anyone noticing. And here's another problem. What most people expect from a criminal investigation comes from TV shows. In movies, a single drop of blood or a strand of hair is enough to solve the crime. But reality doesn't work that way. Forensic science relies on well-preserved evidence. If the crime scene is contaminated in the early hours, even the most advanced technologies can become useless. The result? The best chance of finding Madeleine, in understanding what really happened that night, was lost before anyone even noticed. But if the investigation failed at the start, there was still something that could have helped. The clues found at the scene. Or did they only bring more questions than answers? At this point, the police had lost control of the situation. Journalists were swarming in front of the resort. Headlines were spreading around the world, and every new clue seemed to lead to a dead end. The first major frustration came from the security cameras. The resort had surveillance, but there was no clear footage showing Madeleine leaving the premises. No video of a stranger carrying a child, no suspicious movement. It was as if she had disappeared without leaving a trace. And then reports of sightings began. In the months following the disappearance, various people around the world claimed to have seen Madeleine. First in Morocco, where a tourist said she saw a blonde girl with light eyes accompanied by a group of adults who seemed out of place. Then in Malta, Belgium, and even Brazil. Every new lead rekindled hope, and each ended in nothing. But why did so many people believe they had seen Madeleine? This is where a psychological phenomenon known as the Putkanan Mandela effect comes into play. Often, the human brain reconstructs memories based on what we already know or what we want to believe. If someone sees a girl who resembles Madeleine and is already familiar with the case, there's a high chance they convince themselves they truly saw her. And while the public clung to these sightings, the police had to deal with another possibility. What if Madeleine never left the resort? This theory began to gain traction when British sniffer dogs were called in to examine the apartment and a car rented by the McCanns weeks after the disappearance. What these dogs found was something that would completely change the course of the odors. One detected the scent of human blood, the other the odor of corpses. When taken to apartment 5A, where the McCanns were staying, both reacted to the same spot, behind the living room sofa. That in itself was odd, but the most intriguing discovery occurred when the dogs were taken to a car rented by the McCanns weeks after the disappearance. There, in the trunk, the same scent was detected. What did that mean? For the Portuguese investigators, this was the missing clue. The theory that Madeleine had been taken by a kidnapper began to give way to a much darker possibility. What if something had happened inside the apartment? What if somehow the girl had died that night and the disappearance was in fact an attempt to cover it up? But there was a problem. The scent detected by the dogs was circumstantial evidence, not concrete proof. Experts note that environmental factors can influence such results, and without DNA samples confirming Madeleine's presence, this finding alone wasn't enough to prove anything. Even so, it was enough for the Portuguese police to begin treating the parents themselves as suspects. The McCanns, for their part, reacted with shock and indignation. Jerry and Kate insisted they were being unfairly targeted, that the investigation had taken a wrong turn, and that while the police were focusing on them, the true kidnapper remained at large. And this dispute between the police and the McCanns ended up diverting attention from something even more important. If Madeleine was truly taken that night, who took her? Now, there were two possibilities, and each brought disturbing questions. If Madeleine was kidnapped, why did no one see anything? If she never left the apartment, what really happened that night? And more importantly, after all these years, can the truth still be uncovered? At this point, the case was no longer just an investigation. It had become a global spectacle. Madeleine McCann's face was on newspapers, television programs, and campaigns around the world. But while the public awaited answers, the Portuguese police began to follow an unexpected path. Up until that moment, the main theory was that of a kidnapping. But with the lack of witnesses, no clear footage, and the discovery made by the sniffer dogs, a new hypothesis began to emerge. What if Madeleine never left that apartment? The police started questioning the parents themselves, not because they had direct evidence against them, but because there were many things that simply didn't make sense. Gonçalo Amaral, the detective leading the investigation in Portugal, advocated for this theory. To him, the most likely explanation was an accident inside the apartment, followed by an attempt to cover up the truth. That would explain the biological traces detected by the dogs. That would explain the open window, perhaps not for a kidnapper's entry, but to create a convincing scene. That would even explain Kate McCann's reaction when returning from the restaurant and immediately screaming that her daughter had been taken. How could she be so sure before even considering all possibilities? But there was a problem. No concrete evidence supported this theory. The traces found by the dogs were not confirmed to belong to Madeleine. The DNA collected was inconclusive, and any hypothesis based solely on the dog's scent was not enough for a formal accusation. The Portuguese police believed they were on the right track, but without solid evidence, international pressure began to mount against this approach. And then, something unexpected happened. Gonçalo Amaral was removed from the case. Officially, it was an administrative decision. Unofficially, many believe that the British government exerted pressure to remove the detective. Since his theory placed the McCanns in an extremely delicate position, Amaral's removal changed everything. The hypothesis that the parents were involved lost momentum, and the case was once again treated as a kidnapping. But Amaral did not abandon the case. Years later, he published a book titled A Verdade da Mentira, The Truth of the Lie, in which he exposed his suspicions and detailed what he believed had been an investigation cut short. The book became a major point of conflict. The McCanns sued Amaral for defamation, claiming he was trying to destroy their reputation without evidence. The lawsuit dragged on for years until Amaral eventually won the right to continue presenting his version of the story. By that time, the truth was completely fragmented. On one side were those who believed that the McCanns were victims and that Madeleine was indeed kidnapped. On the other, those who thought that the story concealed something much larger. And amidst it all, one question remained unanswered. Where was Madeleine? The McCann case became a perfect example of how public attention can shape do not receive this level of coverage. Statistics show that less than 5% of such cases result in concrete resolutions. Most of the time, the media covers the story for a few days and then moves on. But the Madeleine case was different. From the start, media involvement was massive. Celebrities like David Beckham and J.K. Rowling offered their support. Millions of dollars were raised for the searches. The British government monitored every step closely. And this raises an important question. Can excessive attention distort an investigation? Criminologist Mark Williams Thomas, known for his involvement in high-profile cases, believes it can. According to him, when a case reaches such a magnitude, the investigation begins to be influenced by external factors: political pressure, financial interests, and the need to satisfy public opinion. At that point, the McCann case turned into a maze with no exit. There were so many versions, so many clues, so many contradictory accounts that it became impossible to distinguish fact from speculation. Over the years, both British and Portuguese police pursued different approaches. With every new clue, a new wave of hope emerged, only to be dashed shortly after. Alleged sightings of Madeleine were reported around the world, but none were confirmed. And then we come to the most uncomfortable question of all. What if we never get an answer? There are cases that remain unsolved for decades, simply because the truth was lost in time. And in the McCann case, that may have happened in the very early moments of the investigation. Time passed, new technologies emerged, but what really happened that night remains a mystery. And now we come to the most intriguing point. What happened to the main suspects? And why has this case still not been solved? The Madeleine McCann case continues to be one of the greatest criminal mysteries of our time. Years of investigations, suspicions, and conflicting theories have passed, yet there is still no definitive answer. What really happened that night? Was it a premeditated crime, an opportunistic kidnapping, or something that was always right before our eyes but no one wanted to see? Some experts, like Colin Sutton, believe that the lack of concrete evidence is the biggest obstacle to solving the case. Without direct proof, all that remains are theories. Some suggest that Madeleine might be alive, living under another identity, much like J.C. Dugard, who was rescued after 18 years in captivity. Others believe that the truth was buried in the early days of the investigation, and that no matter how many new clues emerge, we will never truly know what happened. And that is the most unsettling part of it all. The possibility that Madeleine might still be alive is both frightening and, in a way, hopeful. But what if the answer has already been discovered and we never realized it? Now I want to know your opinion. Do you think Madeleine might be alive? Or do you believe that this mystery already has an answer, but it simply has never been accepted? Comment below and share your theory. And if you like cases like this, there's another mystery you need to know about. In the next video, we'll talk about a disappearance that seemed impossible until one detail changed everything. Don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel to follow more investigations like this. The truth might be closer than we think.